Evening, everyone. Today, I might go on a little longer than usual because I have two stories that I'm going to read from it to you. The first is from the book of Exodus in the Bible. And the book of Exodus describes how the Israelites escaped from slavery in Egypt. It begins with the birth of Moses and the amazing story of how this Hebrew child became part of the inner circle of the Pharaoh. Exodus tells of how the Hebrews were mistreated as slaves and how Moses negotiated the release of his people from Egypt, which is a familiar story for any of you who are familiar with the Jewish Passover Seder. Exodus then tells of the Hebrews wandering in the desert for 40 years until they came to the land of Canaan, the land promised to them by God. It is during the wandering of the Hebrews in the wilderness that the covenant between God and the whole Hebrew people is established in the events at Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the 10 commandments from God and delivers them to the people. Now, it's thought that the stories in Exodus were collected and written down by historians who were part of King David and King Solomon's courts as a way of documenting the story of the origins of their people. Now, the time of King David and King Solomon was about 1000 BCE. And so they were writing about events that happened about 500 years earlier. So because the story is told so long after the events occurred, it's not so much a firsthand account, but rather a weaving together of the history and all the stories and legends that told how God rescued the Hebrews. So today we're going to focus on the story of how the Hebrews fed themselves during Exodus when they wandered in the desert for 40 years, including how God delivered manna from heaven, which they made into bread for their daily use. So as I read it, I want you to think about what makes this story repeatable? Why is it important, and why might people want to tell it over and over? And why did it continue to be told for centuries until it was finally written down? Here. So this is from Exodus 16, 1 through 31 and 35. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people should go out and gather enough for that day. And that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said all this to the Israelites. "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the Lord complaining of the Israelites, and say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and then shall you know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that God has given you to eat. This is what God has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer, which is a unit of about 3.7 quarts, an omar to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their tents. The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some gathering less. But when they measured it with an omar, those who were gathering more had nothing left over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. By morning by morning, they gathered it, as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omars apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what God has commanded. Tomorrow is the day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded. It did not become foul, and there was no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is the Sabbath. Today you will find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some people went out to gather, and they found none. God said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. You do not leave your place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. The house of Israel calls it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So, some things to think about that we might take away from the story. God gave them bread to eat when they were hungry. Food is important to our survival, of course, but it's also an expression of community. And sharing food can mean many more things than just, we often share food more than just because someone's hungry, right? And think about giving your friends some of your candy bar or something. And sharing food has many more meaning in a lot of cultures than simply satisfying our physical need. Food is often cooked for another as a gesture of love or caring, and often can help create, when you share food together, it's can help create a sense of community. Another thing to think about is that on the day before Sabbath, God gave them enough manna for 2 days so that they could rest on the Sabbath. God also told them to gather what they need according to how many people were in their tent, in their household. And let me go back to the text. He said, so the Israelites did so, some gathering more, some gathering less. And they measured it with an omar, and those who gathered more, they had nothing left over because they had more people to feed. And those who gathered little, they didn't have a shortage because they didn't have as much people to feed. So this helped ensure that there was enough to go around for everyone. So I also want to tell you another story, another Hebrew story about two brothers this time. Once there were two brothers who inherited their father's land. The two brothers divided the land in half, and each one farmed his own section. Over time, the older brother married and had 6 children, while the younger brother never married. One night, the younger brother, who never married, lay awake. He thought, "It's not fair that each of us has half the land to farm. My brother has 6 children to feed, and I have none. He should have more grain than I do." That night, the younger brother went into his barn and gathered a large bundle of wheat. He climbed the hill that separated the two farms and went over to his brother's farm. Leaving the wheat in his brother's barn, the younger brother returned home, feeling pleased with himself. Now, earlier that very same night, the older brother was also lying awake. It's not fair that each of us has half the land to farm, he thought. In my old age, my wife and I will have our grown children to take care of us, not to mention grandchildren, while my brother will probably have none. He should at least sell more grain from the fields now so that he can provide for himself with dignity in his old age. So that night, he too secretly gathered up a large bundle of wheat and climbed the hill. He left the grain in his brother's barn and returned home, feeling very pleased with himself. Now, the next morning, when the younger brother went into his barn, he was surprised to see the amount of grain was unchanged. I must have not taken as much wheat as I thought, he said, he bemused. Tonight, I'll be sure to take more to my brother. At the very same moment, his older brother was also standing in his barn, musing much the same thoughts. After night fell, each brother gathered a greater amount of wheat from his barn and in the dark secretly delivered it to his brother's barn. The next morning, the brothers were again puzzled and perplexed. How can I be mistaken? Each one scratched his head. There's the same amount of grain here as there was before I cleared the pile for my brother. This is impossible. Tonight I'll make no mistake. I'll take the pile down to the very floor. That way I'll be sure the grain gets delivered to my brother. The third night, more determined than ever, each brother gathered a large pile of wheat from his barn, loaded it into a cart, and slowly pulled his haul through the fields and up the hill to his brother's barn. At the top of the hill, under the shadow of the moon, each brother noticed a figure in the distance. Who could it be? When the two brothers recognized the form of the other brother and the load he was pulling behind, they realized what had happened and what they had done. Without a word, they dropped the ropes of their carts and embraced. The end. I just love that story. I just find it so charming and wonderful. And it kind of reflects the text that we read in Exodus, in that the brothers were both more concerned with the other brother getting what they needed than what himself wanted, than each of the brothers each wanted for themselves. And instead of just evenly dividing up the harvest, they thought about and considered what the actual needs of the other brother were, and thought that the harvest should be divided based upon these needs. So that's similar to the story in Exodus, in that God divided up the manna based upon, or told them to Israelites to base it, they'd each take someone from each tent would gather it, but take enough for however many people they had to feed, so that those who had more to feed got more manna, those who had less to feed didn't need as much, so that everyone in the end had enough. And so I think that's a good lesson for us in all things, not just food, to think about how different people have different needs and taking that into consideration. And you might recall our lesson on equity and equality, and this would be an example of equity. Both these stories really are, in that of people getting things based on what they need instead of everyone getting the exact same thing. And as food is so important for our survival, with these brothers, it meant a great deal that these brothers were so careful to think about the amount of food that the other needed, even if they were thinking about it in different ways. So your assignment this week is to think about the role that food plays in your life. And think about how it may play out in your community in terms of equity, or maybe it doesn't. And then think about it more individually too, not just as the physical need that you need food to eat, or you want to eat because it tastes good, because it's a donut or a cake and it's just really good. But think about how food takes a part in the celebrations in your life and traditions and all the rituals that are a part of your family and community and your life. Have a great week. I will see you next time.